Graham Hayes stared at the screen in front of him and felt nothing except the heavy weight of exhaustion that had lived in his bones for 3 years now, and the words on the transfer order blurred together as his tired eyes tried to focus on them, but he already knew what they said because his department head had told him yesterday, with that fake sympathetic smile that made Graham want to punch something, but he was too tired even for anger now. And Station Kepler 7 sounded like exactly what it was, which meant the middle of nowhere doing nothing important for 6 months, and normally a scientist with his credentials would have been insulted by such an assignment. But Graham felt only a dull sense of relief, mixed with the bitter taste of failure that had become his constant companion, and he closed the tablet and looked around his university office at the boxes already packed with research papers and equipment that nobody wanted anymore because his project had failed, and failed spectacularly after 3 years of promises and funding and expectations that he could not meet. The particle acceleration research had been his dream, and he had convinced the university board and 3 different funding committees that his theoretical framework for electromagnetic field manipulation would revolutionize physics and open new doors in quantum mechanics and material science, and for 2 years, everything had gone according to plan, with promising early results and papers published in respected journals and conference presentations where other scientists actually seemed interested in his work, but then the math stopped working, and the practical applications that everyone expected never materialized, and the funding dried up faster than water in a desert, and the review board called him in for a meeting where they smiled and nodded and suggested that perhaps he needed a break from the pressure of cutting-edge research. And Dean Morrison had actually used the phrase "builds character" when describing a remote outpost assignment, as if Graham were some fresh graduate student instead of a physicist with 15 years of experience and publications in major journals. He should pack the rest of his things, but instead Graham just sat there in his office chair and stared at the wall where his degrees hung in their frames, and wondered when exactly everything had gone wrong, and whether he had missed some crucial detail or made some fundamental error in his calculations, or if the universe had simply decided that his ideas were too ambitious and his reach had exceeded his grasp, and the exhaustion made it hard to care anymore about questions that had no answers, and he realized he had not slept properly in months because every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed all the moments where he could have done something different and maybe achieved success, instead of this hollow failure that tasted like ashes. The shuttle to the orbital transfer station left in 4 hours, and Graham still needed to finish packing and say goodbye to colleagues who would smile and wish him well, while secretly feeling relieved that they were not the ones being shipped off to some forgotten listening post at the edge of human space. And he stood up slowly, because his body felt as heavy as his thoughts, and started putting the last items into boxes with mechanical efficiency, and his hands moved without conscious direction as his mind drifted through memories of better times when research had felt exciting instead of crushing, and when possibilities had seemed endless instead of completely exhausted like he was now. Station Kepler 7 was a listening outpost, which meant it sat in deep space, monitoring sensor arrays for anomalies or threats or anything unusual that might require attention from Earth Command. But from everything Graham had read in the briefing materials, nothing unusual ever happened out there. And the station had 4 crew members, which told him everything about how important the military considered this assignment. And the primary duties involved checking automated systems and filing reports and making sure the sensors kept running, and it sounded mind-numbingly boring, which was exactly what Graham wanted right now, because he could not handle any more pressure or expectations or the weight of other people depending on him to achieve something extraordinary. The journey would take 5 days through multiple jump points, and Graham planned to spend most of it sleeping, because he had years of missed rest to catch up on, and maybe in the silence of deep space without the constant noise of university politics and failed experiments and disappointed faces, he could finally get his mind to shut up for a while and just exist without the crushing weight of inadequacy pressing down on every thought, and the idea of 6 months where nobody expected anything from him except basic competence felt like a gift, even if it came wrapped in the package of professional exile and academic failure. He sealed the last box and took one final look around the office that had been his workspace for 8 years, and felt nothing except a vague sense of relief that he would not have to come back here anymore and face the questions and the sympathy and the knowledge that everyone knew his research had failed, and his career had stalled, and his bright future had dimmed to a barely flickering light. And Graham picked up his travel bag and walked out without looking back, because there was nothing left here worth remembering. The shuttle terminal was busy with travelers heading to various stations and colonies, and Graham found a quiet corner to wait for boarding and pulled out his tablet to review the Station Kepler-7 briefing materials one more time. And the station commander was Lisa Ford, who had a solid service record and a reputation for running efficient operations, and the other crew members included an engineer named Danny Price and a xenobiologist called Karen Shaw, and they all seemed competent and professional, which hopefully meant they would not ask too many questions about why a physicist of his background had ended up assigned to a remote listening post doing routine sensor monitoring. The boarding call came over the speakers, and Graham joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the shuttle with their bags and carry-ons, and he found his seat near a window and strapped in and watched through the small porthole as the shuttle detached from the terminal and began its ascent toward orbit and Earth, fell away below them, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a blue and white sphere hanging in the black void of space. And Graham felt something in his chest loosen slightly as the distance grew, because up here, nobody could reach him with their disappointment and their questions and their expectations that he could no longer meet. The jump to the first transfer station was smooth, and Graham spent the time sleeping or staring out the window at the stars and trying not to think about anything important, and the exhaustion made everything feel distant and unreal, like he was watching his own life from somewhere far away. And maybe that was better than being fully present for this slow-motion disaster that his career had become, and he changed shuttles twice more over the next few days, and each jump took him farther, from Earth and closer to the edge of human-controlled space, where Station Kepler-7 waited in the darkness between stars, doing its quiet work of monitoring and waiting and accomplishing nothing particularly important, which made it perfect for someone whose importance had been proven to be vastly overestimated. On the 5th day, Graham finally saw the station through the shuttle window, and it looked exactly as uninspiring as he had imagined, with its standard orbital platform design and sensor arrays extending like metal branches into space, and the whole structure looked small and lonely floating there in the vast emptiness, and he thought that was fitting, because he felt small and lonely too, and maybe they would suit each other well for the next 6 months. The first morning at Station Kepler-7 began with a soft chime that pulled Graham from the deepest sleep he had experienced in years, and for a moment he forgot where he was until his eyes focused on the unfamiliar ceiling of his small quarters, and the porthole showing stars instead of the city lights he was used to back on Earth. And he lay there for several minutes, just breathing and feeling the absence of the constant anxiety that had been his companion for so long. And it was strange how the silence of space felt more peaceful than the noise of campus life had ever been. Commander Lisa Ford had given him a basic rundown of his duties the previous evening, and they were exactly as boring as advertised, which meant checking the automated sensor systems each morning to verify they were functioning properly and reviewing any flagged anomalies, which Ford assured him were usually just cosmic rays or stellar emissions that the computer classified as unusual but rarely meant anything important, and then filing a brief daily report, and the rest of his time was essentially his own to use however he wanted. And Ford had said this with a completely straight face, as if having nothing to do for most of the day was normal and expected. Graham made his way to the small mess hall where the coffee maker sat like a shrine to caffeinated survival, and he poured himself a cup and took a sip, and was surprised to find it actually tasted good, which was unexpected, given that everything else about the station seemed designed for pure functionality rather than comfort. But apparently someone had cared enough about coffee quality to ensure the machine was properly calibrated, and later he would learn this was Danny Price's doing, because the engineer believed that good coffee was essential to maintaining sanity in isolated environments. The sensor station in the operations center became Graham's morning routine, and he would sit there with his coffee and pull up the overnight logs and scan through pages of data that all said essentially the same thing, which was that space remained large and empty and unremarkable, and occasionally there would be a spike in cosmic radiation or a distant stellar flare, but nothing that required more than a simple notation in the log, and after the first week, Graham could do the whole process in about 20 minutes, which left him with vast stretches of time where he had absolutely nothing he needed to do. At first, the emptiness bothered him because he had spent years living in a state of constant busyness where every hour was scheduled and every moment had a purpose, and suddenly having whole days with no obligations felt wrong and uncomfortable, like he was forgetting something important. But gradually he began to realize that the discomfort came not from having nothing to do, but from years of conditioning that told him his worth was measured by his productivity and usefulness. And out. Here on Station Kepler 7, nobody cared if he spent 3 hours just staring out the porthole at stars, because there were no deadlines or expectations, or people watching to judge whether he was working hard enough. He started sleeping, and not just quick naps between obligations, but real deep restful sleep that lasted 8 or 9 hours at a time, and he would wake up feeling actually refreshed instead of that groggy, half-awake state that had been normal for years. And his body began to remember what it felt like to not be constantly flooded with stress hormones and cortisol, and the physical sensation of relaxation was so unfamiliar that at first Graham did not even recognize it. The other crew members gave him space, which Graham appreciated more than they probably knew, and Commander Ford ran the station with quiet efficiency and handled all the communications with Earth Command, and managed the operational details without bothering Graham unless his input was specifically needed. And Danny Price spent most of his time in the engineering sections, performing maintenance and making small improvements to various systems, and he had a habit of humming while he worked, which Graham found oddly comforting during the rare times their paths crossed in the corridors. Karen Shaw, the xenobiologist, was younger than Graham, and still had the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved their work, and she spent her days studying samples and writing research papers that she transmitted back to various institutions. And sometimes Graham would see her in the mess hall and she would talk excitedly about some microscopic organism or cellular structure, and her passion reminded him of how he used to feel about physics back before everything became about funding and politics and proving himself to committees who did not really understand his research anyway. The station had a small observation deck that nobody seemed to use much, and Graham discovered it during his second week and started spending time there just sitting in the dim light and watching the stars and the nearby nebula that gave the whole region a faint purple glow, and it was peaceful in a way that made his chest ache because he had forgotten that peace was even possible, and the universe felt vast and indifferent, and somehow that indifference was comforting because it meant his failures did not matter on any cosmic scale. Coffee became a ritual rather than a necessity, and Graham found himself drinking it not because he needed the caffeine to stay awake, but because the act of pouring a cup and wrapping his hands around the warm mug gave him something to do with his nervous energy, and the station went through coffee supplies faster than regulation anticipated, which Danny joked about during one of their brief conversations, and Graham felt mildly embarrassed until Danny admitted he was responsible for at least half the consumption, because good coffee was one of the few luxuries available in deep space. By the end of the first month, Graham realized that the constant exhaustion that had defined his life for 3 years was slowly lifting, and he no longer woke up feeling like he was drowning before the day even started, and his thoughts were clearer and less clouded by the fog of chronic fatigue. And he started to notice small things like the way the starlight reflected off the sensor arrays, or the subtle vibration of the station's life support systems, and it was like his senses were coming back online after being dimmed for too long. The daily reports became almost meditative in their simplicity, and Graham would sit at his terminal and type brief summaries of sensor readings and system status, and file them without any anxiety about whether they were good enough or detailed. Enough because nobody seemed to care as long as the basic information was there, and this lack of scrutiny felt liberating, after years of having every word he wrote picked apart by reviewers and colleagues looking for flaws or weaknesses in his arguments. Karen tried once to engage him about his previous research, and she mentioned reading some of his papers on electromagnetic field manipulation, and said the theoretical framework was fascinating, and asked if he planned to continue that work while at the station, and Graham had deflected the question with a vague answer about needing a break from that project, and she had nodded and not pushed further, which he appreciated, because talking about his failed research felt like picking at a wound that had not quite healed yet. The third month arrived without Graham really noticing the passage of time, because the days blended together in a comfortable routine of coffee and sensor checks and quiet hours spent reading or thinking, or sometimes just existing without any particular purpose, and he realized one morning that he had not thought about the university or his failed project or any of his old anxieties in several days, and the absence of that constant mental noise felt strange and wonderful, like taking off a heavy backpack after carrying it for miles. Space was vast and empty, and nothing ever happened, which was exactly what Graham needed. and the station drifted through the void, performing its quiet function of watching and monitoring and being ready for threats that never came. And the 4 crew members existed in their separate bubbles of routine and occasionally intersected for meals or brief conversations, but mostly respected each other's solitude, and this arrangement suited Graham perfectly because he had no energy left for the complex social dynamics that academic environments seem to thrive on. Commander Ford did weekly check-ins where she would ask how he was settling in and whether he had any concerns or needs, and Graham always said everything was fine, and he meant it because for the first time in years, he actually felt something, approaching fine instead of the desperate exhaustion and quiet despair that had colored everything before, and Ford seemed satisfied with his answers and never probed deeper, which suggested she understood that some people came to remote stations, not because they wanted adventure, but because they needed distance from whatever had broken them. The coffee maker became Graham's favorite piece of equipment on the entire station, and he learned its quirks and preferences and how to coax the best flavor from the beans in storage, and Danny caught him adjusting the machine's settings one day and grinned and said, "Welcome to the obsession," and they spent 20 minutes discussing optimal brewing temperatures and extraction times, and it was the most animated conversation Graham had participated in since arriving, and he realized he was actually enjoying himself in this small, simple way that required nothing from him except interest in a shared mundane pleasure. By the time Graham hit the 3-month mark at Station Kepler 7, he had transformed from an exhausted hollow shell of a scientist into something more human, and the bone-deep fatigue had faded to a manageable. The alert woke Graham at 3 in the morning station time, and his first foggy thought was that something had broken, which happened occasionally when sensors picked up interference or a system glitched and needed reset. But when he pulled up the notification on his quarters terminal, he saw the classification tag that made him sit up straighter in bed, because the automated system had flagged an anomalous energy signature in Sector 7 Delta and labeled it as unknown, which was different from the usual equipment malfunctions or natural phenomena that triggered most alerts. He threw on clothes and grabbed his ever-present coffee mug more out of habit than actual need, and made his way to the operations center where the main sensor array dominated an entire wall with its display of their monitored space, and the anomaly pulsed there as a yellow marker in the lower quadrant, and Graham slid into his station chair and began pulling up detailed analysis, because protocol required verification before escalating anything to Commander Ford, and he was probably looking at a stellar flare or equipment glitch anyway, despite what the computer thought. The data made him frown and set down his coffee mug and lean closer to the screen, because the energy signature did not match anything in the database, and he had spent enough time reviewing sensor logs over the past 3 months to recognize when something genuinely unusual appeared, and this was genuinely unusual in a way that made the small hairs on the back of his neck stand up. And he ran a full diagnostic on the sensor array to rule out equipment problems, but everything checked out as functioning normally. Graham increased the resolution and focused the sensors more tightly on the anomaly location, and what emerged in the data made his breath catch, because the energy signature had structure and patterns and repetition, and nothing natural produced patterns like that, which meant this was artificial, which meant something made by intelligent beings, and he felt his exhaustion. Dulled brain suddenly snap into sharp focus for the first time in months, as he stared at readings that should not exist in empty space. He flagged Commander Ford with a priority alert, and she arrived in the operations center 6 minutes later looking alert despite the hour, and Graham gestured at the display without preamble and said it was an artificial energy signature, and Ford leaned in to study the data with the kind of calm assessment that came from years of military training, and asked if it could be a ship with engine trouble, or maybe one of the frontier colony vessels that had strayed off course. Graham pulled up a comparative analysis and showed her the frequency distribution, and explained that this did not match any human propulsion system in the database, and the energy output was too large, suggesting something massive. And Ford was quiet for a moment processing this information, and then tapped her communication badge and called Danny Price and Karen Shaw to the operations center immediately, and her tone carried enough urgency that both of them arrived within minutes looking worried. The 4 of them spent the next hour dissecting every aspect of the readings, and Danny confirmed the sensors were working perfectly with no signs of malfunction, and Karen ran the signature against every known xenobiological phenomenon that could produce energy emissions and came up empty, And Graham kept digging deeper into the data with a growing sense of unease, because the more he analyzed, the worse it looked. He isolated different frequency components and the computer began resolving distinct energy sources, and Graham counted 5, then 10, then 20, and kept counting as more signatures emerged from the overlapping patterns, and he announced that there was more than one source and began separating them on the display. And Karen made a small sound of shock as the markers multiplied across the screen, 50 separate signatures all moving in precise formation, and Graham plotted their trajectory with hands that were suddenly not quite steady, and the vector pointed directly toward human frontier colonies, toward settlements full of civilians who had no idea anything was coming their way, and Ford said quietly that this looked like a fleet and asked for full spectrum analysis. Graham compiled everything the sensors could tell them, and the picture became clearer and more disturbing with each layer of data, and the energy signatures showed sophisticated shielding technology that bent and absorbed sensor readings to create an almost perfect cloak. And if Graham had not been running a deep space scan at exactly the right frequency during his routine check, they would have missed the fleet entirely, and it would have reached the colonies without any warning. Commander Ford asked how many ships they were detecting, and Graham ran calculations based on energy distribution and formation spacing, and estimated between 200 and 300 vessels, possibly more, because some signatures might be masking. Multiple ships in the operations center fell into heavy silence as everyone absorbed what this meant. 300 ships moving in coordinated formation using technology that could hide them from standard sensors heading toward human space. And this was not pirates or lost merchants. And this was not anything humanity had encountered before, and Graham felt ice in his stomach because he understood what they were looking at, which was an invasion fleet. Ford shifted immediately into command mode and told Danny to prepare all communication arrays for maximum transmission, and told Karen to pull everything available on unknown species in this sector, and told Graham she needed detailed projections on time to nearest colony and fleet composition, and anything else he could determine about their capabilities. And her voice was steady and professional. But Graham could hear the underlying tension because they all understood how bad this was. She moved to the communication station and opened a priority channel to Earth Command, and identified herself and reported detecting what appeared to be a hostile fleet of unknown origin heading toward frontier colonies, and said she was transmitting all sensor data and repeated that this was a priority alpha alert, which was the highest threat classification available. And her words felt surreal, because Graham had come to this station expecting 6 months of boring routine. And instead, they had stumbled onto something that could mean war. Graham barely heard the rest of Ford's transmission because he was lost in the data, and his mind was racing through calculations and analysis faster than it had moved in years, and the exhaustion that had defined him for so long was completely gone, replaced by sharp focused intensity, and he mapped the fleet's course and calculated they were approximately 6 days from the nearest colony, which was a mining settlement called New Bristol, with a population of 50,000, mostly civilians. The shielding technology fascinated and terrified him in equal measure, because it operated on frequency-based principles, creating an electromagnetic envelope that absorbed and redirected sensor readings, and it was sophisticated beyond anything humanity currently possessed, and Graham realized with a sinking feeling that if their shields were this advanced, their weapons were probably equally impressive. And the frontier colonies had minimal defensive capabilities because nobody had expected to need serious military installations that far from Earth. Ford returned from communications and said Earth Command was responding, and military fleet deployment would take at least 8 days, and they were ordering immediate evacuation of frontier settlements. And Graham looked up from his calculations and said the invasion fleet would arrive in 6 days, which meant the evacuations needed to start immediately, and even then, they might not get everyone out in time. Karen asked if they could track the fleet's movements, and Graham said yes. Now that he knew what to look for, he could modify their sensors to compensate for the shielding frequency, but that did not help the colonies because their standard defensive systems would not see the fleet until it was right on top of them, and by then it would be too late to do anything except die. The weight of that reality settled over the operations center like a physical presence, and Graham stared at the display showing 50 enemy signatures creeping across space toward unsuspecting civilians, and something stirred in the back of his mind like a half-remembered dream or a discarded piece of research that his exhausted brain had buried months ago. frequency-based shielding and electromagnetic field manipulation, and the failed project that had destroyed his career and driven him to this remote station. And suddenly Graham was seeing connections that had not existed before, or maybe had always existed, but he had been too tired and too defeated to recognize them. He asked Ford to send him all the data on the alien shield frequencies and said he needed to check something, and Ford looked at him with sharp attention and asked what he was thinking, and Graham said maybe nothing or maybe something, but he needed a few hours to work through some calculations. Karen wanted to know if he had an idea, and Graham stood up from his station and said he had theoretical research from his previous work that might be relevant, and he was not making any promises, but there could be a connection between the shield, technology, and some principles he had explored before, and he needed time to verify whether his instincts were correct or just desperate wishful thinking. Ford told him to take whatever time he needed and said they would continue monitoring the fleet and coordinating with Earth Command, and Graham headed toward his quarters with his mind already racing through equations and theoretical frameworks, and for the first time in 3 years. Graham's quarters looked like a physicist's fever dream, with holographic displays floating in midair showing equations and wave patterns and three-dimensional models of electromagnetic fields and cold coffee mugs scattered on every surface, and he had been working for 6 hours straight, pulling apart his old research and comparing it to the alien shield frequencies, and somewhere around hour 4 he had found it, which was the connection that made everything click into place. The particle acceleration project had failed because the energy requirements were impossible with current human technology, and he had been trying to create a stable electromagnetic field that could manipulate matter at the quantum level, and the mathematics were sound. But the practical application required power generation systems that simply did not exist, and the University Review Board had been right when they said it was too theoretical and too far beyond what humanity could actually build. But Graham had not been trying to create a defensive shield, and he had not been trying to counter someone else's technology, and he had been trying to create something far more complex and ambitious. And now as he looked at the alien shield data, with fresh eyes he realized that if he simplified his framework and stripped away the quantum manipulation aspects and focused solely on electromagnetic field generation, then maybe, just maybe, the math could work. The alien shields operated on rotating frequency patterns that cycled through different wavelengths to avoid detection and deflect incoming weapons fire, and it was sophisticated and elegant, but Graham knew from basic physics that every shield had a resonance frequency, and if you could identify that frequency and broadcast it at the right amplitude, you could disrupt any barrier, no matter how advanced. The problem was that the alien shields cycled too quickly for standard analysis, and by the time you identified one frequency, they had already moved to the next, and human technology could not predict the pattern fast enough to counter it effectively, and this was probably why they felt confident attacking human space, because their shields would make them effectively invulnerable to conventional weapons. But Graham was not looking at this with conventional thinking, and his exhausted brain that had spent 3 years failing to solve an impossible problem suddenly found itself facing a different impossible problem, and somehow the perspective shift made everything clearer, and he pulled up the sensor data, showing shield fluctuations over time, and began searching for patterns. Every artificial system had patterns because they were built by beings with limitations, and those limitations created mathematical structures that could be analyzed and predicted. And Graham spent 2 more hours diving into the frequency shifts, looking for the underlying equations, and he found it buried in what appeared to be random variations, which was a mathematical progression that was elegant and complex, but ultimately predictable once you understood the base formula. He ran projections forward and mapped the shield frequencies for the next week, and then pulled up his old research on electromagnetic field generation and began adapting the theoretical framework to create a counter-frequency system. And his hands moved across the holographic controls with confidence he had not felt in years, because this was what he was good at, which was seeing patterns and connections that other people missed. The station's defensive array was designed for basic force shields and electromagnetic pulse generation to deflect space debris, and it was not meant to be a sophisticated countermeasure system, but the underlying hardware was flexible enough that with significant modifications, Graham thought he could reprogram it to emit targeted counterfrequencies that would resonate with and disrupt the alien shields. In theory, at least. And theory was all he had right now. Commander Ford knocked on his door after he had been working for 8 hours, and Graham let her in without taking his eyes off the displays and gestured at his calculations and explained that the alien shields used rotating frequency patterns, but the rotation followed predictable mathematical rules, and if he could predict the frequencies, he could counter them. Ford studied the displays with the focused attention of someone who had spent years making life or death decisions based on incomplete information and asked how he would counter the shields, and Graham showed her the modified defensive array design and explained resonance principles and how every shield could be destabilized if you hit it with exactly the right frequency. She asked if it would work, and Graham paused because that was the question everything depended on, and he said theoretically yes, because his old research covered similar principles, but he had never tested any of this, and they had no time for proper trials. And he was essentially asking her to trust calculations based on a failed project that had destroyed his career. Ford was quiet for a long moment and then said that if Graham was right, this could level the playing field, and Earth Command needed this information regardless of whether it worked, and she told him to transmit his findings immediately, and Graham was already working on the data package and sending it to Earth Command with detailed explanations of his theoretical framework and the proposed counter-frequency system. The problem, he explained, was that the counter-frequency needed precise calibration and real-time adjustments, and it was not something you could just load into a ship's computer and deploy automatically, and it required dedicated hardware and someone who understood the underlying physics, making constant modifications as the alien shields adapted. Ford understood immediately what this meant and said they would need to modify Station Kepler-7's defensive array to prove the concept, and if it worked here, then Earth Command could potentially replicate the system on military vessels. But the station would become the test platform, and Graham nodded because he had already reached that same conclusion. She asked what would happen if the fleet came to their position, and Graham met her eyes and said then they would find out if his theory worked under actual combat conditions, and the unspoken reality hung between them, which was that a listening outpost was not designed to fight, and if the aliens decided to attack them directly, the station's limited defensive capabilities would not last long. Ford made her decision with the kind of calm certainty that Graham envied, and told him to proceed with the modifications, and said Danny Price would help with the hardware work, and she would clear everything with Earth Command and prepare the station for possible engagement. And then she paused at the door and asked why Graham had given up on his research if the theoretical framework was this sound. He said the university had declared it impossible and too theoretical with no practical applications. And they were probably right, because he had spent 3 years chasing something that could not be built with available technology. And Ford looked at him with an expression he could not quite read and said apparently they were wrong, and told him to get to work because they had 2 days before the fleet reached intercept range with New Bristol Colony. After she left, Graham stood alone among his equations and displays and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, which might have been hope or determination, or just the simple satisfaction of having a problem that mattered, and a possible solution that came from all those years of work that everyone had said was worthless. He called Danny to his quarters, and the engineer arrived quickly and took one look at the chaos and whistled low, and asked if Graham was really planning to turn their defensive sensors into a weapon system, and Graham said not a weapon, but a shield disruptor, and showed Danny the technical specifications. Danny studied the schematics with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years making theoretical designs work in practical reality, and said the modifications would burn out half their systems if they pushed the hardware this hard. But yes, he could make it work, and asked how much time he had, and Graham said 12 hours. The engineer grinned and said he better get started then. And they worked side by side for the next 12 hours with Graham handling the theoretical calculations and software modifications, while Danny managed the physical hardware changes and rerouted power systems, and Karen Shaw helped by monitoring the approaching fleet and coordinating communications with Earth Command, while Ford managed everything else and prepared contingency plans. Station Kepler-7 transformed from a sleepy outpost into a hub of desperate activity, and Graham found himself running on adrenaline and coffee and the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing that thousands of lives depended on whether his math was correct and his instincts were sound. Danny sealed the last access panel on the modified defensive array 12 hours later and announced the system was online, and he had rerouted all available power to the emitter nodes and they could generate Graham's counter frequency, but it would drain their reserves fast, and Graham ran a diagnostic, and the readings looked good, at least in theory. He suggested they test it at low power, and activated the system and fed in the projected shield frequencies, and the defensive array hummed to life, emitting a precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulse, and the sensors registered the emission and confirmed the frequency matched his calculations exactly. Karen reported amplitude was stable with no system failures, and Graham increased power gradually. While watching for any instabilities, and the array held, and at 50% power, he ran a full simulation projecting. The alien fleet arrived exactly when Graham's calculations predicted, and he watched from the operations center as hundreds of ship signatures crossed into their sensor range and moved through space with the coordinated precision of a military formation that had trained together for years, and Commander Ford had put the station into full stealth mode, with all non-essential systems powered down, and they were running as dark as possible, hoping the aliens would not notice one small outpost. In the vast emptiness, Graham's modified sensors picked up details that standard arrays would have completely missed, and he could see the shield fluctuations and power signatures and weapons arrays charging as the fleet prepared for their assault on New Bristol Colony, and he updated his frequency calculations in real time, because the alien shields were cycling exactly as his projections had predicted, which meant his theoretical framework was holding up against actual data. Ford stood behind him watching the tactical display and said quietly that they were running full stealth protocols, and the aliens should pass them by without incident, and Graham nodded, but kept his hands on the defensive array controls just in case, because something in his gut told him that a fleet this sophisticated might have detection capabilities that could see through basic stealth measures. The fleet moved past their position, maintaining perfect formation, and Graham tracked each vessel and refined his understanding of their technology, and the shields were more advanced than anything humanity possessed, but they followed rules and patterns, and physics was physics regardless of which species had developed the technology. And he felt a strange sense of professional appreciation for the elegant mathematics underlying their defensive systems. Karen reported that New Bristol had evacuated 70% of their population, and civilian transports were jumping to safer systems, but that still left 15,000 people on the surface who could not get out in time, and the alien fleet was 2 days from the colony, and Earth Command's military response was still 4 days away, which meant those 15,000 civilians were going to face an invasion with no protection. Danny had his hands on the power systems, ready to reroute everything to the defensive array if needed, and he looked tense but focused, and Graham thought about how 4 random people assigned to a forgotten listening outpost had somehow become humanity's first line of defense against an alien invasion, and the absurdity of that should have been funny, but he was too focused on the sensor readings to appreciate the irony. The lead elements of the alien fleet were moving beyond their position when the sensors registered a change, and 3 ships broke formation and altered course, and Graham's stomach dropped as he realized they were turning toward Station Kepler 7, and Ford said they had been detected and told everyone to battle stations. Graham brought the counter-frequency array online, and his hands moved across the controls with steady confidence, despite the adrenaline flooding his system, and he said the system was ready, and if his calculations were correct, the alien shields would drop when they came into range, and if his calculations were wrong, then they were all about to die in the next few minutes. Ford opened a channel to Earth Command and reported they were engaged by hostile forces and were activating the experimental defense system, and her voice was calm and professional, as if she were reporting routine maintenance rather than a potential death sentence, and Graham supposed that was what good commanders did, which was stay calm when everyone else wanted to panic. The 3 alien ships closed rapidly and their weapons powered up, and Graham could see them on the visual display now, and they were sleek vessels with an organic aesthetic that suggested their builders thought differently about ship design than humans did, and they were covered in the shimmer of active shields that bent light and sensor readings around their hulls. 2,000 kilometers in closing, and Graham watched the range counter tick down, and his finger hovered over the activation control, and 1,000 kilometers, and the aliens were moving fast and confident, like they expected no resistance from a small outpost in 500 kilometers, and Ford said they were firing. Brilliant blue energy lanced across space from the alien weapons, and Graham hit the activation control, and the station's defensive array screamed to life, broadcasting his carefully calculated counter frequency at maximum power, and for one terrible, Heartbeat, nothing happened, and Graham thought he had failed again, and his theory was just another useless pile of mathematics that worked on paper but not in reality. Then the shields around the 3 alien ships flickered and wavered and collapsed completely, and the alien weapons fire that had been designed to overwhelm shields and then penetrate armor suddenly hit unprotected hull, and one ship staggered. As its weapons array exploded in a chain reaction that tore through its forward section, the other 2 ships scattered and their formation broke apart, and they seemed confused by the sudden loss of their primary defensive system, and Graham felt a surge of fierce satisfaction because his theory worked, and the impossible, theoretical, research that had destroyed his career was actually functioning exactly as the mathematics predicted. Karen said it worked with disbelief in her voice, and Graham adjusted the frequency in real time because the aliens were trying to compensate and modify their shield patterns, and he needed to stay ahead of their adaptations, and it became a deadly dance with the aliens changing their defensive frequencies and Graham predicting their changes and altering the counter frequency to match. His old research had covered exactly this scenario, and the theoretical framework included adaptive algorithms for responding to shield modifications, and what had seemed like over-engineering 3 years ago was now the only thing keeping them alive as the aliens realized they were facing something that could counter their most advanced technology. The 2 remaining ships regrouped and attempted a coordinated attack, but without shields they were vulnerable to Kepler-7's defensive weapons, which were designed for clearing space debris, but worked well enough against unshielded targets, and Danny fired the point defense lasers, and one alien ship took a direct hit to its engine section and began spinning away, venting atmosphere. The 3rd ship retreated fast and broadcast on all frequencies, and Graham caught fragments of the transmission through the sensor array, and it sounded like a warning, or maybe a call for reinforcements, and Ford said the rest of the fleet was responding, and they had 30 ships breaking off from the main formation and heading toward the station. 30 ships against 1 listening outpost with 4 crew members and an experimental defensive system that might burn out at any moment, and Graham felt remarkably calm as he expanded the defensive array's broadcast range and pushed the system to its absolute limits, and every light on the station dimmed as power diverted to the counter-frequency emitters. Ford reported that New Bristol was broadcasting their counter-frequency data to approaching civilian vessels, and the colony's defensive systems were being modified based on Graham's framework, and it was buying them time for the evacuation, and at least his work would help save some of those 15,000 people, even if Station Kepler-7 did not survive the next few minutes. The alien reinforcements arrived in attack formation with weapons charged and ready, and they had clearly decided that this small outpost represented a significant threat that needed to be eliminated, and Graham broadcast the counter-frequency, and 30 shields collapsed simultaneously across the entire attack group. What followed was chaos because the aliens had apparently relied completely on their shield technology as their primary defense, and without it, their tactics fell apart like a strategy built on a single assumption that suddenly proved false, and they scattered, with some trying to retreat while others pressed forward with desperate aggression. Station Kepler-7's defensive systems fired continuously, and Danny rerouted power frantically to keep weapons online, while Graham maintained the counter-frequency broadcast and adjusted it constantly as the aliens tried different shield configurations and searched desperately for a frequency pattern that his system could not counter. But Graham had spent 3 years developing this theoretical framework, and he had explored every possible variation and adaptation, and his mathematics were sound, and the aliens were encountering something they had never faced before, which was an enemy who understood the fundamental physics of their defensive technology better than they did. One alien ship broke through the defensive fire and launched projectile weapons at close range, and the station shuddered as impacts tore through the outer hull, and Karen reported breach in Sector 4, and emergency bulkheads were sealing, but they had lost atmosphere in that section, and Graham held his position with hands steady on the controls because if he stopped broadcasting even for a moment, the alien shields would come back online and they would all die. 2 more alien ships disabled, and 3 more and 5 more, and the defensive lasers were overheating, and Danny said they were burning out systems faster than he could compensate, but the counter-frequency array was still holding, and Graham's fingers flew across the controls, making constant micro-adjustments to stay ahead of the alien adaptations. The remaining alien vessels broke off suddenly and retreated toward their main fleet, and they had apparently learned that attacking this